I've been working on archaeology for a long time now, it seems. One of the things that I focused on the most in my PhD studies was this late Bronze Age, which is essentially the time of Moses, Joshua, and the Judges. So this has been of considerable interest to me for many different reasons, and something I have spent a lot of time on and tried to find where's the missing evidence, or what else is out there.
Thank you all for your diligence and persistence. Stay right through the end. It's great to have such good numbers right to the end. We're getting lots of texts and things too from people watching online, and that's exciting. I just wanted to say a few words. This is obviously a topic that is of interest to people of religious faith. This is a question or a conference on science and faith. A couple of people have asked me, is about discovery and our mission in relation to these science and faith issues. Our Center for Science and Culture is, we have said for a long time, committed to exploring scientific evidence that supports a broadly theistic understanding of the natural world. We have people here today of a variety of faith traditions, representing each of the three great monotheistic religions, for example. And so last night we had a discussion. A number of the people on the panel were talking about the whole role of apologetics, and we're Christians. And I just wanted to clarify something to make sure people know that we are still very, very friendly in a big tent, in the sense that from the scientific evidence, we don't think that we can settle the discussions between the great monotheistic religions, but rather that we see evidence in support of a creator, something that all three of the great monotheistic religions affirm, and some people who are non-religious theists. And so there is a kind of highest common denominator ecumenicism of this movement as we're talking about the relationship between science and faith, and that hasn't changed. What is interesting, or what's happened here, is that we is evidence of something else that's very important to us, which is we're against cancel culture. So people, we allow people who are Jewish to speak from a Jewish point of view, or people who are Christians to speak from a Christian point of view, or Muslims from a Muslim point of view, or non-religious theists or agnostics to speak from that point of view. So if there are people expressing personal points of view that are an aspect of the way they think about science and faith, we just want to be clear that we're still welcoming to people who have other perspectives, theistic or otherwise, as they're thinking about these issues of design and nature. Now, the issue of the Exodus is obviously something that relates to the biblical revelation, but interestingly, the Moses story is something that's held in common by all three of the great monotheistic traditions, and so it's of particular interest, and we're going to talk about that not so much from a religious standpoint, but from a scientific or archaeological standpoint today. And I've had the privilege of knowing Titus, who's really the star of the show today. I'm just framing things, and I'm gonna interview him, because I really enjoy some of the things that come out in these, more of a dialogue. And I first met Titus when he was 17 years old on a basketball court. I was a professor at the local college where he was a high school student, and I was, I think, 40 or something. Don't do the math to figure out how old I actually am. And all I remember is his dunking over us older guys. And so as a result, I showed him some proper respect afterwards and chatted him up, because he just humiliated us, and discovered that he wanted to be an archaeologist. And he was very interested in what the archaeology had to say about the reliability of the biblical text, in particular. Well, we'll find out about that. So we've known each other for a long time. After he had finished his master's degree in ancient and Near Eastern studies from the University of Toronto, and was, prior to going off to do his PhD, I hired him to help do a fact check on everything I'd been teaching in a course on archaeology and the Bible, before I taught something called the True You series, which some of you may know about. And Titus did a fantastic job on that. And in the process of developing that material for this film teaching series that we did, I presented, but Titus was the brains behind a good chunk of it, we developed an argument for the historicity of the Exodus account based on the archaeological data that we have that is, in a way, very simple and very straightforward. And there's been so many different theories about all this. And we're excited to present this because we think it kind of cuts through some of the complexity of this. And Titus, can you bring up the map? And I'm going to just frame this, and then we're going to have a discussion about the details, which Titus knows a great deal more than I do. So if you look at the map, you'll see the Nile Delta there on the left. And is it possible to bring that into bigger aspect and actually see Palestine, Canaan area as well?
That one didn't make it in.
That's the only one we got. Okay. Yeah. So if you know your basic geography of Egypt, you've got the Nile Delta, and you've got the Mediterranean Sea, and then as the land arcs around, you get to what was ancient Canaan. And there is a biblical way of dating when the two different chronologies that you can use to date when the Israelite slave population would have left Egypt. And that date, taking the biblical witness at face value, is something around 1446 BCE. And with a 40-year period of wandering in the biblical story, we would then expect the Israelites to arrive in the land of Canaan sometime around 1406, 1400 BCE or BC. And so you've got 2 points on the map. You've got the Nile Delta, the land of Goshen, and you've got Canaan. And so what we realized is that you've got extensive evidence of an Israelite slave population in the Nile Delta region prior to 1446 BC. And then after about 1410, 1400 BC, you have evidence of a migration of Hebrews, Israelites, into Canaan, and after a period of time, they become the dominant people group in that area. They were slaves at point A, time 1 in Egypt, and they become the dominant people group at point B, time 2 in Canaan. So, simple deduction, there had to be an exodus. They got from A to B. And they were slaves, they were no longer slaves. It's that simple, really. That's what the evidence shows, and that's what we're going to discuss today. So let me begin with Titus, and we'll have a conversation about this. This is fantastic. Titus, tell us just a little bit more about your background first. So, other than meeting me on a basketball court, you've had some very distinguished accomplishments in your life.
Well, I've been working on archaeology for a long time now, it seems. Started my freshman year in high school actually working on excavations, and now I've worked on projects in 5 different countries and all sorts of different periods, from the early Bronze Age or even the Neolithic period through the Byzantine period. So, covering all these different aspects of biblical history. And one of the things that I focused on the most in my PhD studies was this late Bronze Age, which is essentially the time of Moses, Joshua, and the Judges. And later on, I got more into the Roman New Testament period. But so this has been of considerable interest to me for many different reasons, and something I have spent a lot of time on and tried to find where's the missing evidence, or what else is out there that we haven't found or interpreted or connected to this event that might be so.
Yeah, absolutely. And we often hear from scholars who are sometimes categorized as biblical minimalists that there's no evidence for the Exodus whatsoever, that the Israelites or the Hebrews didn't really exist as a people group until, maybe about 1000 BC or 900 BC, that they kind of congealed. The theory is they congealed out of the Canaanite hill country without having had a prior history in Egypt. And so maybe we should start there. What is the evidence for the existence of the Israelites prior to that time that the biblical minimalists say actually marks the origin of that people group?
Well, the most obvious evidence for Israelites as a distinct group of people in Canaan before this, what we call the Iron Age, or before the monarchy period, would be the Merneptah stele, a very, very well-known artifact. It was a a stele, a monument stone of the Pharaoh Merneptah in the 13th century BC, probably around 1220 BC is when he had it inscribed. And he talks about some of his accomplishments and his campaigns. And in one section, he says that he goes to Canaan and he lays waste to this place. And he cites 3 different cities that he defeated. And one of them is geographically situated in the north, one is central, and one is south. And so he's trying to give a picture of the whole land. But then he just talks about one group of people that he defeats, and he says that Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more. And he doesn't talk about any other tribal groups. So yes, there would have been some other tribal groups. We know that from the biblical text also. But the Israelites were the important one. They are the dominant one. And he uses this name, Israel. And so that's really the earliest universally accepted time from archaeology that we have Israel. But this is long before the monarchy period. And they're there, they're established. It's the 13th century BC. You know, how did they get there? How did they come into that position?
And as to they are laid waste and no more, this was actually, as I understand it, fairly typical of ancient kings, this sort of hyperbole about their conquests. We see this throughout history with the Babylonian kings. And but let's go back a little further. So this would be during the period, according to the biblical chronology, of the sometime after the conquest of Joshua. So let's go back a bit further, because and first maybe talk about how if you take the biblical timelines that are actually in the Bible, how would you come to a date for the Exodus? Where would you expect it to happen? Because as I understand it, part of the reason that at least in your reckoning and others, that some scholars have not found evidence for the Exodus is they've been looking at a time period that doesn't correspond to the biblical date for the Exodus. In other words, they're looking in the wrong search window.
Yeah, that's generally how it's been for several decades. There were some shifts in viewpoints and popular dates, but for many, many years, it was the 13th century BC was the window that was being looked in. Now, if we go to the biblical text and we look at these passages and we take them at face value, the numbers that they give us at face value, then we start with the reign of Solomon. So Solomon is universally accepted as beginning his reign in about 970 BC. And 1 Kings 6:1 tells us that it was in the 4th year of Solomon's reign that he started building the temple, and it tells us that this was the 480th year of the Exodus after the Israelites came up out of Egypt, what we might call the Exodus era. So why do I call it the Exodus era? Well, this is a way in ancient times of assigning dates and assembling a type of chronology that people could build from. A significant event happened, like the Olympiad, etc. So this was used in the Greek world. And we see this used in the book of Numbers, for example, Numbers 33, and elsewhere in the wanderings. They'll talk about, this length of time from the Exodus. So that gives us a key. We take that at face value, 479 completed years from the 4th year of Solomon. Like you said, we get to about 1446.
So you do a little math, basic math, and it's a subtraction problem.
Yeah,
Okay.
But that's not the only reference that we have that would make us think of that date. And because there are some scholars who look at that number and they say that it's figurative and it shouldn't be taken as a real number. We have to just look for some other markers, and it's not going to be 479 years prior. We can go to Judges 11:26, though. It talks about in the time of Jephthah. Jephthah tells us that the Israelites have been there for 300 years from his time. Now, we don't know the exact date of Jephthah, but he's just a little bit before Saul. He's somewhere around 1100 BC. You add the 300, you add the 40 wandering. Again, we're getting to about the same date.
You get a couple of different independent chronological markers that are pointing to roughly the same time. So let's just take that then as a hypothesis as to when the Exodus occurred. It's striking that scholars haven't been looking there at all. They've been looking 200 years later for that evidence. But so is there evidence of an Israelite slave population, or maybe a broader Semitic population at least, of slaves in the Nile Delta prior to that 1446 BC date?
Well, we can start with the broader Semitic issue. Semitic people, or Asiatics as the ancient Egyptians called them. And the answer is yes, there is abundant evidence of these people living in the Nile Delta region prior to the time of the Exodus, prior to the time of the settlement of Canaan by the Israelites. You look at sites like Tel El Daba, very famous one, which is identified as Ramses and Avaris. Or you look at another site like Pithom, or what has been identified as Pithom. Many others in this region, you have a lot of evidence from archaeological material that people from Canaan had moved there. And so they set up things like temples to the gods that they worshipped rather than the Egyptians. They had a specific way of making their distinct pottery, their tools and weapons and burials. Then we also have more easy to interpret, perhaps, evidence. Things like a wall painting. So there's a famous wall painting in the tomb of Khnumhotep II, and it shows people from Canaan migrating into Egypt. There have been a couple of statues of Asiatic officials who rose to prominence in Egypt, kind of like Joseph did. So we know that those general type of people are there.
But now, as I understand it, you've got kind of concentric rings of people classifications. You've got Asiatics who are coming from the east of Egypt. Within the Asiatics, there are Semitic peoples, and within the Semitic peoples, there are the distinctively Hebrew people.
So,
and do you have evidence of do you have evidence just of the larger general Asiatic group, or is there actually evidence of the smaller rings within the rings?
Yeah, so we get to the more specific, and that would be people like the Hebrews. So the Semites, the Asiatics, we've got some other inscriptions like Hatshepsut, who was a pharaoh during the 15th century BC, queen. She talks about these Asiatics that lived in the Nile Delta, calls them vagrants. Some people interpret that as sheep herders. They don't worship the sun god Ra. So we're getting some connections to the Israelites and the Hebrews. We've got evidence of Semites being enslaved. Again, wall paintings are very useful because they illustrate these things that would otherwise take a lot of text to write. You see the picture, it's easy, it's visual. But then we get to, are there actually Hebrews or Israelites?
So just to interrupt for clarity, so you've got all Hebrews are Asiatics, all Hebrews are Semites, but not all Semites or Asiatics are Hebrews. But if you've got Semites who are also depicted as slaves, they might well be Hebrew slaves. And we do know that you've got an extensive slave population of people who've come from Canaan in the Nile Delta region, just based on the material culture of these places that have been excavated. Is that?
Yeah, so some of the general data fits. But in order to be able to distinguish a tribal group like the Hebrews, because, of course, at first they're just a family that expanded,
yeah, right.
We really have to look for some specific markers. And the Egyptians themselves weren't going around talking about these small tribes by name. But there is a very, very interesting Egyptian document, this Papyrus Brooklyn, that lists all these household servants or slaves. And it gives their original name first, and then it gives their new Egyptian name. So that's a practice that we actually see in the Joseph story. He gets a new Egyptian name. And many of these names are Semitic. Of course, Hebrew is part of the Semitic class. But then others look like they are specifically
They're
Hebrew
specifically
names.
Hebrew.
They are biblical Hebrew names that we find within the Bible.
And so this is a record of the slaves or servant populations in a large Egyptian estate. Is that okay?
Yeah,
and so what are some of the names?
Well, a lot of them are female versions of male Hebrew names that we might be familiar with, like Menahema rather than Menahem, or Asherah instead of Asher. The name Shifra is found in there. Actually, sometimes this is called the Shifra Papyrus because of that. And she, of course, is one of the midwives that's mentioned by name in the early story of Exodus, Exodus 1. We have also a form of David's name found in there. And then at the end, we have very interesting one that looks like a transcription of Hebrew into Egyptian.
So you actually have the name Hebrew as...
It seems like someone had the name Hebrew. They were named for the people group or maybe for the eponymous ancestor. But it seems like very strong evidence. We really can't ask for something more specific than this. I mean, they weren't really a nation at this time, so we can't expect the Egyptians to be saying like the Israelites over here. Okay, well they weren't really the Israelite nation at that time. They were sons of Jacob, descendants of Jacob, who was renamed Israel.
No, I mean this is very compelling. These are very specifically Hebrew names and variants. And also, was it also the case that there was a predominance of females over males among in the records of the slaves, suggesting that
especially for household slaves, yes, because the men would be making the bricks, building the buildings, working out in the fields more, and the females, yes, in the households. But also, it's a lot easier to control a slave population if you don't have the men growing up being big and strong and aggressive and rebelling against you. And so there have been times in history, like in Egyptian history, when they would eliminate more of the males in the slave population.
And that comports with the biblical record as well. Yeah. Okay, so well, that's some pretty interesting evidence, and I know there's a lot more, but let's talk about. Well, that's quite an interesting list. I'm just looking at the different names that have been attested. Let's shoot forward 40 or so years, skip over that wandering period. What kind of evidence is there? We've already talked about the Merneptah stele, but what kind of, if you want to say more about this, one fun story is that when we were doing the True You series, I was the teacher not only of the material about the scientific evidence for God, but of the biblical material. I was an established professor, and Titus was still on his way up. Now he's mentoring me in all this stuff. He actually did for the presentation in front of the cameras in this studio classroom, and he taught me to read hieroglyphs. And so for the Merneptah stele and one other I'll tell you about, I actually explained what the hieroglyphs meant to the students as if I knew, but Titus had just explained to me backstage how to read them for the presentation. I was posing a bit, to tell you the truth. Okay, let's talk about what's the evidence of the entrance into Canaan? And I know this was also your PhD work, right? Was on tell about the PhD a little bit first.
Connected to my PhD work, looking at the demography of Canaan during this period, and I was trying to answer the question of not only what was the approximate population and what were other aspects of that, like the age at death or infant mortality and household size, but also seeing if there was a demographic shift around this time that could indicate some major event like a migration or a takeover of the land.
And what did you find?
We'll show you. Okay, there was a demographic shift.
There was a demographic shift.
Yes.
Okay, so
we can start with Jericho.
Yeah. Anything more on the Merneptah stele? Because that is, it's quite striking that you actually have Israel mentioned there and there's something about the structure of that Egyptian description of the different tribes that implies that Israel was the dominant people group.
Because they're the only group of people that is mentioned in that section of the stele that's concerned with Canaan. So they're the only ones worthy of being mentioned in Canaan. It tells us, again, they are the dominant people group. They're number one in the area.
So if we only had the Brooklyn papyrus and the Merneptah stele, we would have strong prima facie evidence for an exodus, because you've got slave population in Egypt prior to the biblical date, and then evidence of the Israelites becoming the dominant people group in Israel. In this case, it would be a little later. It'd be about 200 years later, but something happened.
Yeah, we could at least say archaeologically that the general outline of the story is attested.
But there's a lot more. So let's dive into that. What are some of the other evidences of the presence and entrance of an Israelite population into Canaan?
Well, when they enter in, of course, there's the war. They're fighting against all these Canaanite city-states, and in archaeology, we like destructions because they're easy to distinguish usually, and they often preserve these cities, or at least sections of them, so that when we dig down, there's something for us to find. We can date it. We can look at the method of destruction. And Jericho is a very interesting case both archaeologically and in the biblical record, because in the book of Joshua, there are many details that are given about that siege and conquest of the city that are, in a way, archaeologically testable. We can see if they correlate to the archaeological record. There's the presence of the city itself. There's the fact that it had walls. There's the walls fell down upon themselves. It says they weren't battered back into the city.
So there wasn't a siege of the city in the Joshua account, and
a particular way in which that ended up, and even at a particular time period. It was after spring harvest in the text. It's indicated. So we also have, of course, the burning of the city, and then the non-looting of the city except for specific metals. And all that stuff we can explore through the excavation of the site, and it has been, and all of those things correlate. So the manner of the destruction, or the manner of the fall of Jericho, matches the record in the book of Joshua on multiple fronts.
And this was first discovered by two excavations in the 20th century. There was a German one, I believe, in the early 1900s, and then the famous one by John Garstang, who was very impressed with the points of convergence between the biblical testimony and what he found archaeologically. The most striking thing is that there was this, as I recall, this retaining wall. They called it a revetment wall or something?
Yeah, the retaining wall is the one in the left photo. So that's the stone wall, if you can see the man standing there. So that's like retaining walls are built today. But on top of that was the mud brick city wall. And it's the brick wall, that's the one that collapsed. So the retaining wall is still there, but all the brick was found collapsed except for one section of the wall.
And the wall, as I recall, fell outward, not inward, as it would from a typical siege, where the battering rams knocked the
right.
The
and
walls
so
in.
the explanation then was offered by some scholars that it must have been an earthquake, because this doesn't fit the method of siege warfare with battering rams. But it's also so strange that if you go around the different points of the wall where it's been excavated, as I said, it fell down everywhere except for this one spot. So it's not like the army just went in and assaulted this one point. The wall was annihilated all around the city.
And there was some grain discovered.
Grain, these massive storage jars of grain. So instead of using a pantry or a cupboard or a refrigerator back then, they used these huge ceramic vessels that they would put partially in the ground, and they would store olive oil in there. They would store grain. So as I said, this happened soon after the spring harvest. They'd harvested everything. They'd put it in storage. Many of these jars were full, and they found that they had been burned like that. Now, normally, an army would actually want to siege before harvest so that they could starve the city out and also feed their troops on the unharvested grain in the fields. Well, if they didn't do that, then it would be normal for them to loot the food that was in the city so they can feed themselves. Food wasn't so easy to come by back then. Couldn't just order it on Amazon Fresh.
DoorDash for Canaanites?
Yeah. So they burn all of it, though. It's very atypical, but this is exactly how it's described in Joshua 6, that they are supposed to dedicate the city to destruction. It's almost like a sacrifice to God.
So there are two different biblical data points. That the siege happened after the encirclement of the city, happened after the spring harvest, and the grain stores that were discovered were consistent with that. And there was also a biblical injunction against looting, and the preservation of the grain is consistent with that.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when you and I worked up this presentation, we developed a list of things that had been found archaeologically that matched or corroborated a list of propositions from the biblical account. It was quite an extensive list.
Yeah.
So that's a prima facie then evidence for a destruction that matches the biblical account. Did you find in your study of the demography, the population density and so forth of Canaan during that period? And what is the period archaeologically? It's
late Bronze Age.
Late Bronze Age. Did you find that there was the pattern of destruction and burning of cities matched the pattern described in the book of Joshua?
I would say yes. does, where we've been able to investigate it enough.
There was a specificity of match. So the cities that were described as having been destroyed were in fact destroyed during that period in the archaeological
Jericho,
record.
for example, although the chronology of this site is debated, like many are, I would say one of our most important pieces of evidence comes from the scarabs that were discovered at Jericho that were honoring Hatshepsut and then Amenhotep III, and that's the conclusion. And those were pharaohs that reigned during the 15th century BC. Amenhotep kind of bridges 1400 BC. That's the last one attested. It seems like the city
So
falls.
this is really important, right? Because you've got the original excavation from John Garstang, but then another archaeologist comes along in the 1950s named Kathleen Kenyon. She sees all these same things, but she says it has nothing to do with Joshua because she dates the remains at a much earlier point in history. So she sort of just shifts in her mind's eye the time scale and says, well, this has nothing to do with the Joshua. It matches the description in the Bible, but it happened much earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so that kind of persists as a consensus among scholars, but then subsequent evidence has suggested that actually Kathleen Kenyon misdated this. And one of those pieces of evidence is scarabs that were found. Were they buried? What was the deal with them?
So most of the scarabs come from tombs, and actually Garstang excavated many of these scarabs. And she seemed to not really
She just missed them.
She just didn't interact with a lot of his material too much.
But these are scarabs commemorating pharaohs that lived after the time period that Kenyon had identified as the period of destruction.
The usual explanation has been that people came back to the city, or nomads used the tomb and buried their dead in there. But this doesn't really make sense because these tombs are of elite people. They are buried with very expensive imported pottery, and pottery that was trying to also imitate pottery imported from Cyprus, for example, and then these scarabs, which were made in Egypt. So there's some trade going on here. It wasn't just Bedouin type of people. And these are not the kind of scarabs that were manufactured after the reigns of those particular pharaohs. Hatshepsut, they tried to wipe her from historical memory. That's definitely not going to be reproduced. We're also not aware of Amenhotep III being reproduced later on either. So there are a lot of things that point to the method of destruction, but also the timing of the destruction there at Jericho.
So yeah, these people existed after the time that Kenyon identified as the destruction, and therefore that can't work. The destruction must have happened later than she said, because these scarabs are in the graves of people from that period of time. Okay, that's pretty interesting. So she might have gotten the timing wrong. Yeah, and isn't there something about pottery too?
Yeah, there's lots about pottery. That might be kind of boring for some people, but yeah, there's a specific type of pottery that came into use in the late Bronze 1, roughly 1500 to 1400 BC, called chocolate on whiteware, and that's also found at Jericho.
Is this the famous Cypriot bichrome two-color?
Cypriot bichrome is similar, but it's a different type of pottery that's with red and blue on it. So that also is a helpful indicator, but the chocolate on white is even more specific, coupled with the scarabs, makes a pretty compelling case.
It's a pottery that's distinctive of a later period than the one to which Kenyon ascribed the destruction.
The problem
and it's present in Jericho.
The problem with Kenyon's conclusions is that she actually didn't publish her excavation reports ever. They didn't come out until after her death. And so no one really was able to go through and see all the material from the excavations that she directed and to scrutinize that. And once they did come out in the 80s, okay, she excavated in the 50s. Once they came out, it had been long settled in academia. So people weren't really thinking, was she right or not? I'm going to spend all this time looking through it.
Consensus science by that time.
Exactly.
Yeah. We've seen that before. Okay. So, and what about one of the other cities that's mentioned in the Joshua account is Shechem? And isn't there, there's something there's a record of a people group entering Canaan. The Canaanites themselves are writing to Pharaoh asking for his help. And this is the Amarna tablets? Tell us
Yeah.
about that, and specifically about how Shechem seems to, the letter from Shechem. I've always been impressed with that.
So within what's called the Amarna letters, the Amarna archive, there are many letters that were written from Canaanite kings, so they're kings of city-states, to the Pharaoh. And many of these we can identify with Pharaoh Amenhotep III because of the name that's addressed on these letters. And time again, they are talking about how some people are attacking their cities, taking over their cities, taking over the land. They call them the Habiru or the Apiru, depends on how you render that. But we see that they're not Canaanites. They're somebody else. Some have made the connection between Habiru and Hebrew, and I think that those actually overlap in terms of it's describing people that were sort of outcasts of society. I wouldn't say they're equivalent terms, but they overlap terms.
Kind of coincidental, don't you think? I mean,
it is, but it's coincidental because not all Habiru have Hebrew names, for example. So there's this group of outsiders. They're coming in and they're attacking even cities that are specifically mentioned as being attacked in the Joshua narrative. We have people like the king of Jerusalem and the king of Gezer and the king of Lachish. In fact, the king of Lachish is assassinated, and we see that's one of the kings that's killed in the Joshua account. But when we get to Shechem, it's a totally different type of situation. Rather than attacking, fighting, destroying all this kind of stuff, we look at Shechem in the book of Joshua, chapter 8 and chapter 24, and there is no fight there. There's no battle. There's no destruction of the city. There's a peaceful gathering, and it's not just a peaceful gathering of Joshua and his army. It's also men, women, and children, and even the natives of the land. So the local Shechemites are also there, and they're reading the law, and they're having this group meeting, and they're later, affirming the covenant. And you're wondering, how in the world did this happen? Because Joshua never mentions them taking over the city. Well, we go to the Amarna letters, and there's a very interesting thing because some of the other Canaanite kings are angry at the king of Shechem, and they make these accusations, and they say that the king of Shechem, they name him Labayu, they say that he gave the land of Shechem to the Habiru. And so it seems, if we're correlating these two, that the ruler of Shechem at the time of Joshua decided, I'm not fighting you. We're giving this land to yours. Maybe he thought it was theirs. Maybe they worked out some treaty.
So there's an agreement between the biblical account of what happened at Shechem during this period and the Amarna letters in very specific detail about how it was that the Israelites came to rule Shechem at that point, that there was a peaceful transfer of power, if you will.
Yeah, and there's even more explanation of the background of what's going on from the archaeological findings.
And so there's this scholarly debate about the exact meaning of Hapiru or Habiru, but in specific detail, the Amarna letters describe the conquest of Canaan in terms that specifically match the biblical account. And so it is reasonable to think that the Hapiru are the Hebrews in this case, even if that term doesn't universally mean Hebrews.
In specific instances, it can be describing them, yes.
Which is another evidence then of a Hebrew entrance, or an Israelite entrance into Canaan after the biblical date for the entrance. Okay. Let's you got a few more things probably from your PhD thesis. Go ahead.
You'd asked about the demographic shift. Right. So what I found from analyzing the demography of Canaan was that you have a fairly even increase in population, which you would expect just in a normal functioning society over time until a point in the late Bronze Age. Around the middle of the late Bronze Age, there's this drop off. And there's a huge population decrease. Some of the cities get abandoned for a while, and then we also see smaller villages that pop up elsewhere that they're new settlements. And this could indicate a few things, but what it seems to be telling us, at least, that cities were abandoned, maybe as a result of war, death, disease, migration, but we don't know where they migrated to. We don't see evidence of that. And then there are new settlements established. And when we analyze these settlements, the material culture indicates that it's a totally different group of people than had been living in these Canaanite cities prior, because their construction methods are different. They build these villages, for instance, where they stick all the houses together in a circle and kind of form a makeshift city wall. They don't have temples, they don't have shrines, they don't eat pigs, they don't have idols.
No pig bones.
Right. And these are hallmarks archaeologically of Israelite settlements. So we see a demographic shift, and then we see new settlements pop up that we can identify archaeologically as Israelite.
And a shift in material culture that is consistent with what we know about the Israelites or the Hebrews. Okay, so we've got evidence of an Israelite or Hebrew slave population at point A, time 1, Nile Delta. We've got evidence of an entrance of that same people group into Canaan after 1400-ish. That's point B, time 2. So we've got prima facie evidence of an exodus. It's a simple deduction. We've got from A to B. They're no longer slaves, so there is an exodus in that sense as well. But it's even possible to track them along the way. And there's a little backstory to this that's kind of interesting. When Titus and I were working on the True You series, he came into the office one day quite excited because he found a kind of obscure article in it was a small theological journal, I think from Little Northwest College in Minnesota or something, where a scholar was describing an inscription from very southern Sudan, very northern Sudan, very southern Egypt in biblical times, that mentioned the God Yahweh. And so we actually discussed this in the True You series when it was filmed, somewhat tentatively, but Titus, being a data guy, decided he wanted to go and see it and to document this inscription. And so he got me in a fair bit of trouble because we agreed to reimburse him for his travel on condition that he would hire appropriate security and would check in with us at certain checkpoints. My wife Elaine loves Titus and knows his family. His big sister was the 3rd grade teacher for both of my sons, and so she wanted to she found out that we were funding his trip, that we'd encouraged him to go. I said, we didn't encourage him. We just said we'd reimburse him. That's different. He's going to go anyway. And he's going to get security, we assured her. Well, he missed all his checkpoint calls, and his security ended up being 2 Italian guys that helped him through passport control and then did nothing after that. So now, at least we can say he's the real deal Indiana Jones, but he went and slept with the scorpions and if you know anything about Sudan, especially in the north, you know it's very dangerous. But he went to get the evidence, and that's pretty exciting. He ended up writing it up in a peer-reviewed journal, the Journal of Nubian Studies, as I recall. So tell us about this inscription. What did you find, and why is it so significant?
So this inscription, actually the temple where it's located, is at a place called Soleb. It's northern Sudan now, as you said. And this was a temple of the Pharaoh Amenhotep III. We've mentioned him before. His scarab appears at Jericho and actually at a lot of other conquest sites. And he's the one to whom many of those Amarna letters were addressed. So we keep seeing him. Yeah.
Okay.
And on this temple, he had these commemorative cartouches made, which were supposed to be showing us that he had either defeated or subjected various locations and people under his rule. And so he does this for all these different areas around Egypt. And on one of the columns, and also on a wall, there's this inscription that mentions a place or people he had supposedly subjected, and it's the land of the Nomads of Yahweh on there. And this is the earliest that the name Yahweh has ever been found in an inscription anywhere. You know, the next earliest, or the other early one, would be the books of Moses, if we're going by composition date. But
so
archaeologically,
just on secular, standard Egyptological dating methods, which you and I both accept, what date would this be? The inscription? What?
Around 1400 BC, plus or minus a few years. And so what is this? Some people have tried to
and the Nomads of Yahweh. That's the Ta Shasu Yahweh? Is that
the Shasu is the Egyptian word that's used there. describing a nomad. So these are not people that are settled in a city. This is not a nation, so to speak. It's also not a location in terms of, it's not a city. It's not the name of a state. And instead, it's a group of people that are associated with this name Yahweh. Well, what is this name Yahweh? We don't know of anything from the ancient world that's called Yahweh other than the name of God. There's no city, there's no nation, there's no body of water, etc. Nothing with that name, which caused most scholars to say, okay, this must have some connection to the Yahweh of the Bible. Although it's so early, they don't like that. And so there's this whole thing called the Edomite hypothesis that, oh, maybe the Edomites worship Yahweh and then the Israelites stole that from them. But if we look through everything Edomite, we find never mention of Yahweh.
And so you went to this place and you got video evidence of
I went to this place because there was no picture of this thing.
Just this record in this obscure theological journal.
Yeah, it's mentioned a few times. It's also mentioned in a sort of popular Egyptological book written by Donald Redford and a few other places, but it was not widely known. But there was no
documentation.
Picture. You couldn't find a photograph of this thing, and it was in danger of being destroyed, possibly too. A lot of monuments.
And you got video evidence
destroyed.
Of it as well.
Yes.
And the inscription describes the movement of these people through a particular region.
It places them approximately in the area of Edom, Moab, Transjordan. So this is in between, it's east of Egypt. It's essentially in between Egypt and Canaan, the settled promised land.
Okay, so wait, let's just stop there because that's super significant, right? Because the biblical account says they're in Egypt and then they get into Canaan, but they go through Moab and Edom and then cross over east of the Jordan. I mean, those are the lands east of the Jordan River that they would have had to pass through during the period of or near the end of the wandering period before entering into Canaan. So what you've got then is not only documentation of the Israelites at point A time 1 and the entrance into Canaan, that's Egypt, before 1446, but entrance into Canaan at point B time 2, that's entrance into Canaan after 1410 or 1400-ish. You've even got a contemporaneous mention of the Israelites during the wandering period on their way from point A to point B.
Right. And why can we identify those with the Israelites? And because that's obviously going to be a question. It says Yahweh, it doesn't say Israelites. But we can because there was no other group of people in ancient history ever, anywhere, that ever worshipped Yahweh. He's only identified with the Israelites. And so it's a pretty easy match. And if we were to analyze the other inscriptions that circle this pillar, we would see that there are also deities mentioned in some of the other cartouches. So it seems to be groups of nomads that are associated with their patron god. And again, this is the Israelites, their association with Yahweh. It's attested on an Egyptian inscription of the Pharaoh. So it tells us the Egyptians were familiar with Yahweh. That connects to what we read in Exodus. And the Israelites are indeed described in the biblical text as the people of Yahweh and as nomads also.
I remember, Titus, when you first told me about this, I thought that it was compelling for all those reasons. And it also seemed to be a very definitive refutation of the biblical minimalists. If the Israelites did not exist as a people group until 900 BC or 1000 BC, and they only congealed out of the central Canaanite hill country and never were in Egypt, then why is the earliest mention of the Hebrew God on an Egyptian monument dating from 400 years before? And why does that inscription place the Israelites right where they should be, according to the biblical account, halfway between Egypt and Canaan?
Absolutely. I think the only mention is because the Israelites were actually there
inference to the best
wandering.
Explanation, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, so folks, it's a very simple case, but we submit it's very compelling. Now, there's another facet of this that I'd like to explore with Titus because he's completely changed my mind about this. I used to be an advocate in my, this is a purely amateur opinion that I developed, of the theory that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was someone called Tutmosis III. And on a walk from our office in Redmond to Jamba Juice one day, that is about 5 minutes, Titus completely disabused me of this theory and explained that there was a much better candidate for the Pharaoh of the Exodus, which actually reinforces this case that we've been making, and that's Amenhotep II. Tell us about him and what the archaeological evidence is as to why he is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. We've been talking about Amenhotep III, talking about the period of the wandering and the entrance into Canaan. He's mentioned in the Amarna letters and on that Nomads of Yahweh inscription. But what's the guy Amenhotep II? He caught your attention? Why is he so important?
So he is the son of Thutmose III, who you mentioned before.
So I was close, at least.
Yes, why that was popular is because we're looking at the biblical date for the Exodus, and these two kings are right around that time.
Okay.
So he comes into power soon before the Exodus. But there are a number of, we might call them circumstantial pieces of evidence that connect to Amenhotep II and the Exodus. The first is just the chronological placement, all right? But we're not going to base everything on that, of course. We can be off on the chronologies a bit, for sure. But the second thing is there's a qualification within the biblical text, actually two qualifications relating to his rise to the throne. And the first is that Moses, he kills the Egyptian, he flees into the wilderness, he's there for 40 years, and then he's told that the Pharaoh has died, and he goes to the burning bush, and then again it's affirmed the men who are seeking your life are dead. So the Pharaoh that was in power when he murdered the Egyptian, he was in power for those 40 years. So he had a reign length of at least 40 years. Then he dies, then Moses returns soon after. So there's two things, this long reign, and then the new Pharaoh is fairly recently installed. Well, Thutmose III, he reigned for 54 years. He's one of the few pharaohs who has a reign of over 40 years. Ramses II is another one, but there are not very many, and there's none around this other time
Okay,
frame.
so that guy's got to die before the Exodus can take place.
Yes.
So it's got to be somebody after a pharaoh who's had a very long reign. Is that okay?
So Amenhotep II comes into power soon after. So we've got some interesting matches there. Amenhotep II was also, though, extremely arrogant and also seemed to be compensating for something. You could look through his text. He's always claiming these superhuman feats. Now, it is true that a lot of ancient kings were very boastful, but this guy goes above and beyond. And of course, he may have wanted to be as great as his father, who was one of the great generals of Egypt, but something he seems to be compensating for. It just fits the general profile of the Exodus Pharaoh. But again, we're not going to base it all on that. There's a military decline that occurs during his reign. Early in the reign of Amenhotep II, he does actually go out and campaign, as traditionally the Egyptian pharaoh did. But then his last campaign is actually not even really a military campaign. It's a slave raid. And we'll look at that in a second. But this cessation of military campaigns for about 100 years is very, very odd. Something's going on there. Either there's a complete shift in the ideology of Egypt throughout this time, or something's happened where they don't have the military capacity anymore. And of course, if he is the Pharaoh of the Exodus and all these men and chariots are destroyed in the Reed Sea, that would be an explanation. We talked about the Amarna letters before. The Egyptians never send help to the Canaanites. They seem incapable of doing it still at that point.
And when does the slave, the raid to go out and get 100,000 slaves?
Just after the Exodus, maybe a year after. It's very, very, very soon after.
And we have an Egyptian record of the...
He had 2 stelae erected that talk about it, and his claim for how many slaves he went and got back. In fact, we'll jump to that. But another interesting thing is that the palace of the Pharaoh was located on the Nile River at this time, at the site of Tel El Daba, or specifically Esbet Helmi, and it was used by a lot of these 18th dynasty kings, including his father, Thutmose III, but then it's abandoned during the reign of Amenhotep II. The excavators don't see archaeologically exactly why that happened. They made a guess that maybe it was some kind of plague that caused people to abandon. But something happens to where they leave this palace. And this palace, it's not like a little building where they decided, it's getting old and run down, let's go build a new one in a different city. This is a palace complex that is equivalent to the size of many of the towns in Canaan at that time. So it's massive. Something drastic happens. The slave raid, though, he claims that he carried off 101,128 prisoners, and then over 1,000 chariots and all these weapons. So it seems like he's restocking the slave population, and he's getting back the military hardware that they need. Or he's claiming to do so to save face.
That's fascinating. So a pattern of circumstantial evidence that fits. Well, of course, the hardest thing to believe about the Exodus is the miraculous element of it. We had a little bit of a discussion about that last night, about whether miracles are possible. And of course, I've maintained, just as a matter of the philosophy of science, that miracles are acts of an agent, in this case, a divine agent. I personally don't think that miracles are a violation of the laws of nature. If I'm playing pool, or if somebody's playing pool and you have a pool cue about to hit a ball, and you know the law of momentum exchange, you can calculate where you would expect the second ball to go. But if someone shakes the table in the middle of the shot, all bets are off. That means the balls are going to go someplace completely unexpected. That doesn't mean that the law of momentum exchange has been violated. It just means that a new event has been introduced into the matrix of natural law, producing an unexpected outcome. Now, if we as agents can do that, then certainly God, the divine agent, can do that. I don't think that miracles are a violation of the laws of nature. They're an instance of agent causation. But the question is there, I mean, one of the great miracles of the Exodus is obviously the plagues. And I didn't mention that we would talk about this, but there is actually an interesting document that seems to, from an Egyptian point of view, describe some of those plagues. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's often called the Admonitions of Ipuwer. Sometimes people just call it the Ipuwer Papyrus. That's because this guy's name, Ipuwer, appears in it. He seems to be the author. From what we can tell, based on other evidence that's been recovered from Egypt, Ipuwer was what we might call a bard. So he writes this poem. This document is a poem. It was probably sung. And as such, it's written as poetry. It's not written as historical narrative. And so we can't directly correlate it to the Exodus historical narrative. It's not written in the same genre. However, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have valuable historical contributions. So the first thing that people would notice about this Ipuwer papyrus is that he mentions that the Nile River is turned to blood, and blood is everywhere throughout the land of Egypt. So that is such an odd and so unique phenomena. People, if they know the Exodus story at all, they immediately associate it with, well, that sounds a lot like Moses turning the Nile River to blood. But if that were the only thing, we might just say that's coincidence. Maybe it was some unknown literary
poetic
device.
Hyperbole or something.
Right. Even though it's very strange that he would choose that. But there are a number of other things that are found in this poem that correlate to the time of the plagues. There's talk about people having their hair fall out and being in such pain that they wish they would die, which sounds a lot like, maybe the boils or something. There's plants being destroyed and the food being destroyed. The cattle, the animals are weeping. They can be in pain. All these things are going on. The food system is destroyed, maybe as a result of the locusts. There's fire that's talked about. Of course, there's the plague that involves fire. And then we jump ahead to something like the day does not dawn on the land of Egypt. So is this talking about the days of darkness?
Yeah.
And Ra is not seen. The power of Ra is not seen. He's the sun god. In fact, I think that plague was specifically targeting the chief god of Egypt there, Ra, the sun god. The palace is overthrown, the Pharaoh. There's children dying. And then there's talk of the slaves get the gold and the silver and the precious stones. And that's the same thing that happens right at the end of that narrative in Exodus. The Israelites get them. Yeah. So there are a number of correlations here that it just seems beyond coincidence that that it couldn't be talking about the Exodus. And these coincidences or these correlations are recognized by many people. In fact, who's probably the foremost scholar in the world on this papyrus, he wrote his dissertation on it and a monograph. He recognizes that. He recognizes the connections, but he says that it can't be talking about the Exodus because both Ipuwer and the Exodus are not historical texts. So that's one way to explain away the correlation. It's there, but it's not historical correlation because neither text is history.
Which begs the question of our whole discussion, I suppose. Yeah. Well, listen, there's if anything more to explore in all this. Titus is writing wonderful books about archaeology and the Bible, and we're just very grateful for your attention today and for your attendance at this wonderful event that's now concluding. Thank you very much.